Hey there riders, Journo Kris here today, and I am here with the awesome new Honda Hornet. Now as you can see, this is a pretty cool looking machine. I'm not so sure about the headlight, but I am really impressed by just what Honda have to offer. I've been lent the bike from MotoHub. This is their demo machine. It is available to test now, so go and check it out if you are interested. But man oh man, have Honda delivered an absolute stonker of a motorcycle, particularly at a $13,500 right-away price here in Australia. And I will put overseas pricing up on the screen as well, because this is a super affordable motorcycle, which really is basically, I would say, taking that 650 class motorcycle and just taking it to a whole new level. This thing is a huge step up in most regards compared to a lot of the 650 competition. Now, one of the advantages, I guess, of the 650 competition is here in Australia, a lot of it is LAMS legal. This bike is not LAMS legal, 90 horsepower. As I said, it is an absolute stonker, and you will not be using this as your first bike. However, as a second bike after jumping up from a 300 to 400cc machine, this thing would be an absolute weapon and so much fun, and such a great machine to then explore your riding a bit further and learn a heap more on. So as far as that, I think the Honda Hornet is going to be a winner, if for nothing else, just simply because of price. It's not a perfect motorcycle. There are a couple of areas which I would say are a bit weaker, but overall the package is absolutely exceptional, and it's much more than the sum of its parts. And while there are those weaknesses, I think they are some fairly common weaknesses in the kind of price segment we're looking at, simply because you got to make compromises somewhere, and Honda have not made that many. So when we're talking about compromises, I don't really think any have been made as far as this 755cc parallel twin, and it is a 270-degree crank, which is my favorite layout of the parallel twins. And I would honestly say, after riding this bike, I'm thinking it's starting to become one of my favorite engine layouts overall. It is just a characterful, torquey, fun engine characteristic with a really nice delivery of power that just does everything I'd want. I'm a bit of a triple fan, but I will say I think this is on par with some of my favorite triples. So it is an absolutely stonking engine. Now, the engine itself, it comes basically with an electronics package which has your traction control, which is the HSTC, I think Honda call it, a torque control system. They've got their own name for it. That is nice to see, a nice little safety boon there. There is of course ABS, which is not relevant to the engine. We've got an engine braking setting, which is done via that dash as well. So you get 3 levels of engine braking, which is a nice little quality of life feature there, and quite noticeable on the bike as well. And then within the modes, you've got your 3 power modes, low, medium, and high. And apparently they all offer the same max performance. It's just the throttle response, it's just how you get there, how quickly you get there, that really does differ. And I will say those engine modes offer 3 very different characteristics. Rain mode, it's fairly stodgy, but that's just what you want. It's got a very high traction control setting, and it's got the mid-range EB at level 2. You move it up to standard, which is probably my favorite mode. You're getting the mid-range power mode. It's got a smoother throttle response. It's not as aggressive as the sports mode, but it's much more direct than your rain mode, and you're getting a much faster build of power, a little bit more free-flowing, everything like that, but still that same mid-range EB. So that's a very nice kind of everyday usable kind of mode. You then move up to sport, which is the most aggressive of the modes, and you do notice it's maybe a little bit snatchy on that throttle. It drops the engine braking down to level 1, which is probably my preference, being totally honest again here, and traction control on level 1. That is a super aggressive kind of mode that you're going to be using when you're having some fun through the twisties, when you're being a bit of a rat bag, and I can tell you what, I had a lot of fun using that mode today. I would probably set the user mode, where you can set any of those settings the way you want. I'd go engine brake 1, I'd go power mode, probably the mid-range, so same as standard in the other modes, and then I would go traction control 1, and I'd knock that down to 0 if I was trying to do wheelies or anything like that. But I'd probably keep it in 1 most of the time. It is worth noting, when you turn that bike off, that traction control will reset in user mode to level 1. It will not stay at 0, so you can't start the bike, have the traction control off, go and do something silly and find that it's not there for you. It'll default to back on. Obviously that's a safety feature, but it's not one I'd personally complain about. However, I know some of the more experienced and quite sporty riders like to have the traction control off entirely. So it's a bit of a compromise there for them. For a little extra depth about the engine, we're talking a 270-degree parallel twin with 90 ponies and just under 70 Nm of torque with a smooth cruising low range below 5,000 RPM that is ideal for relaxed riding on the highway or just through suburbia. There's good pickup and smooth fueling here that'll ensure even commuting in heavy traffic will be fun, easy and enjoyable. The wide bars are the only thing to keep in mind if you're filtering in really tight spaces. Raise those revs into the mid-range and there's a torquey, punchy band which is super rewarding, pulling hard through the relatively tall gears with an exceptional engine how egging you on to have even more fun and be more aggressive on that throttle. Run the bike towards the red line in the lower gears and it doesn't flatten out to the extent the unrestricted 650s do, which granted are 20 horsepower down on power, although I didn't get an opportunity to see just where the bike tops out. Dropping between that torquey mid-range and the lower cruising revs under 5,000 RPM can be less than smooth in comparison, especially if you're running a higher engine braking mode as you dip in and out of that immediate torque band. Knocking it down through the gears quite aggressively is also smooth, that slipper clutch more likely to come into play here. How that power and torque is delivered to the ground is typical of a 270-degree parallel twin, ensuring great feel and confidence with enough performance to still thrill, me at least. At first I was a bit dubious about the move away from a 4-cylinder, however after riding the bike it just makes sense and I think the results speak for themselves, making the change a no-brainer, both for the production benefits, this is no doubt a cheaper engine to produce, but also on the rider side of things for usable, accessible and fun performance. Probably more than you'd really even need on public roads. I'd be interested to see how the Honda accessory quickshifter would go on this bike. I'd be buying that for sure for about 400 plus fitment. You're also buying an actual quickshifter here with a sensor on the shift rod, not just activating a system already on the bike and ready to go, which is a real pet hate of mine on many of the higher end, already expensive machines who expect you to shell out even more for that. While we're looking down at this part of the bike, one thing that is an absolute standout for me that Honda have done, we've got obviously the two headers running back and we've got this tiny little collector here. This is obviously a Euro 5 bike. It's got a alright exhaust on it, nothing amazing, but there's no massive collector under the bike which weighs 5 kilos and looks like, a big piece of poo. You've just got this really nice kind of exhaust system here, which does look the business. And I don't know if you can see, but the muffler does clamp on there. So it's not an all-in-one exhaust system, which would make it expensive to replace. You'll still be able to put on an aftermarket muffler and that shouldn't be too expensive. The engine growl itself is intoxicating. It's got a beautiful, almost V-twin-like kind of engine howl to it. It is all intake howl. It's not at the exhaust end. It is all at the engine end. I don't know whether my GoPro will pick that up at all, but man, oh man, this thing is fun to ride because you can really ride kind of that engine growl. And in sports mode, the engine does seem to be that little bit louder and a little bit angrier, which I do really, really like. I have to say I love this machine so far. Okay, so when it comes to brakes, we are getting these wave disc rotors on the front, as you can see. You're also getting 4-point Nissan calipers. Now, I guess I'll say normally for me, the absolute benchmark in braking is Brembo, and there's quite often times where I kind of wish that bikes had a better brake system on them. It's not the case on the Honda Hornet. It's not that it's like a superbike level braking system, but the level of power is exceptional. It's got really nice modulation and feel. It's a little bit perhaps softer than more aggressive riders would like, but for me, I just found it pretty much perfect for the bike. And obviously that does come into play when we're talking about kind of the support on the suspension, particularly the forks when you're getting hard on the brakes. However, for me, I was just really blown away by how usable the brake system was and how much power there was there. I wouldn't really want any more bite, I wouldn't want any more power, and I felt like the feel and everything like that was really good. I did adjust that brake lever in a little bit closer to the bar because at first it was just too much of a stretch to get to. It does have an adjustable lever as standard, and it's just got a very basic master cylinder there, so you're not getting a radial master cylinder or anything like that. It's still keeping it very value driven. However, the brakes to me are very, very good, or the front brakes are very good. The rear brakes, there's good feel through that lever, that foot lever, but bit of stopping power, it's the usual. It's not a standout, but that's kind of what you expect on this style of bike. So by no means out of the ordinary. And there is ABS. I didn't have any ABS activation. Not that I'd expect it in these very dry and grippy conditions with the Michelin Road 5s fitted, but it is there. And of course, that is just a standard here in Australia. However, in some markets like the US, you may have to pay extra for that. And that's something that I would always recommend doing personally. All right, we're gonna have a quick look at ergonomics. I would recommend taking a look at my full ergonomics video if that's something that you're kind of more deeply interested in. I'm 180 centimeters, 32-inch inseam. I'd say kind of fairly average, but I do have longer legs, so that's worth keeping in mind. I believe this is a 785 millimeter seat height. Maybe it's 795. I'll put it up on the screen either way. So a very manageable seat height for a mid-capacity motorcycle, but also fairly normal for these naked bikes. Easy reach to the ground, quite narrow between the legs. The engine does get a little bit wider, at least on this side. And as you can see here, very engaged peg position. It's on the sportier side of things. It's not a really stretched out bike, but it's a naked bike, you know, slash street fighter as they call them these days. So that's to be expected. The bars, as you can see here, are quite wide and they're a little bit taller than I expected. They fall nicely to hand. I find it a very neutral seating position overall. Obviously, nice and upright, good vision through the mirrors, adjustable brake lever that I already mentioned. It's a really nice neutral seating position that should be inviting to the vast majority of riders. So another really well kind of designed point there. I do feel like those bars are a little bit taller than perhaps I would have expected. For some reason, just the feel of the bike is that little bit taller at the front end, but it works. So no complaints there. I will say, while I'm sitting on the bike, 190 kilos, as soon as you're moving, you really don't feel that weight. It is a light little nimble machine. Pushing it around, maybe not quite so much depending on where you're pushing it. However, as far as riding the bike, even at very, very low speeds, it's a very nice thing to ride, very well balanced overall. And it shouldn't be intimidating for shorter riders who perhaps can only get, you know, a portion of a foot down. I think this will still be an ideal machine. Okay, on the front, we've got Showa separate function forks. They are not adjustable, sadly, and this is obviously a very value-driven motorcycle, so the adjustability on the suspension as a whole is just preload on that rear shock. And I'm gonna say, I think the real weak point on this bike, it's the rear shock. The rear shock, to me, is quite harsh. On nicer roads, you're gonna find this bike very, very rewarding, I would say, because it's nicely supported. Jumping on the bike, you know, if you push down on that suspension, it's got a bit of plushness to it. So it is a one-size-fits-all suspension system. It's got to suit really anyone who jumps on the bike, and that is a very compromised position. And normally, for me, at about 75 kilos, I'm pretty lucky that a lot of these bikes kind of suit me because that's often the figure that they're looking at pretty closely. Whether that's the case on this particular bike, I'm not sure, but while the front end was pretty good, I really wouldn't have any complaints. I think I'd be quite happy leaving that front end regardless. I think the suspension on the rear is something I'd probably spend a bit of money on, taking it to a shop, a suspension shop, a specialist, and getting them to either set it up for my weight or seeing what they could do for me. Because I was finding particularly the compression onto some of those harsher bumps along the old road, which is not the best road, let's be honest, and that may or may not be the norm for you where you are. It was quite punishing. And when we were riding down in Melbourne, I didn't notice it quite as much. As the speeds rise a little bit, it does get a bit better. Certainly I can ride through it, so I wouldn't say you need to upgrade the suspension, at least not if you're at my weight, about 75, 80 kilos. I've got quite a bit of camera gear with me most days. So while I wouldn't say that it's really super necessary to upgrade it, and you could certainly just ride the bike the way it is, I think for a small investment at the rear of the bike, because it's the kind of the one weakness that I personally see, that would be a good place to spend a little bit of money. And I think if you sorted the rear a little bit more than it is as it stands, I think you're gonna have just a tremendous machine that is really basically punching well above its weight. You could probably get the front end done as well, and then if you're getting the bike set up to your weight, I reckon it's probably punching as hard as some of those bikes around that 20K mark, which have the fully adjustable suspension systems and are just way more expensive than the Honda Hornet, where this thing is just incredible value and so much fun. Obviously, that is taking into account some compromises. You're not getting the Brembo brakes, you're getting a more basic suspension setup, which shouldn't really matter once you have it set up for your weight. And that is an investment that you do need to keep in mind and add on top of the price or the investment you're making in the bike. But to me, that would be an easy investment to make. Apart from that, I guess the one other area which I noticed today more than I did when we did the ride down in Melbourne, probably because I was just on the bike more and there were less brakes and less stops, was the seat was just a little bit hard. And it's not unusual for a naked bike, but I felt it was considerably better when I did the ride down in Melbourne. Today I was feeling it a little bit more, but I did find that seat a little bit harsh, which is a small criticism. And like I said, fairly normal in this class of bike, keeping in mind how low that seat height is. So the question will be, should you buy or consider the Honda Hornet? And I'm going to be honest, I think this is really the best value bike at about 13.5 grand. There's very few things that compete with it directly, probably maybe just the Z900 as far as kind of what's on offer. Specifications and electronics, I think it puts most of the 650 class in the dust, and that is a really good thing for competition because everyone else is going to have to lift their game somewhat. But it also doesn't reach kind of up into the stratosphere of being a $20,000 bike, which I could see if it had fully adjustable suspension. It's, apart from maybe a little bit being a little bit more limited on the electronic side of things, you know, it's not all that different than some of the bikes being offered. It's a little bit down on power perhaps on some of those 20K machines, but I think a lot of people would have so much fun on one of these that you don't need to spend, say, that extra almost 50% on a far more expensive bike, or even more than 50%. And you could settle for the Honda Hornet. You'd have a heap of money in your pocket to do mods. There's quite a few accessory packs for this. You can get luggage, you can get some bling, you can do so many things to it. Get an aftermarket exhaust, maybe fix up that shock a little bit, get even maybe a more expensive shock, and you're still going to be laughing. And the performance on this is absolutely staggering. The thing I didn't talk about is the handling. And I think probably the one point on par with the engine in this, which is just a sensational engine, is the handling. The handling is just beautiful. It is a very, very nimble machine. Changes direction super, super easily. I found it a very forgiving thing to ride. You could always kind of, and I'm a fairly conservative rider, but I could always just, you know, add a little bit of lean angle, a little bit of bar inputs, tighten up my line, maybe loosen up the corner a little bit and go a little bit wider, all that kind of stuff. If I was carrying a little bit too much speed, again, it was just so easy to ride this thing fast, and not ridiculously fast. Again, as I said, I'm a more conservative rider, but it was a very, very easy thing to ride and a very forgiving thing to ride and a very confidence-inspiring thing to ride, which really, in my mind, puts it up there with probably some of the bikes which really stand out in that category, like the Street Triples. They've always been just renowned for being beautiful handlers, and certainly I reckon the Honda Hornet now is up there with them in that just exceptional handling department. Let down somewhat by that rear shock, but let's be honest, at 13.5 grand or whatever you're paying locally, there's some compromises somewhere. These are also made in Japan. It is not a Thai bike, it's not an Indian bike, it is not a Chinese bike, it is a made in Japan bike, which does probably cause some supply issues and may limit the supply somewhat because there's only so many they can produce, and they're still recovering from a number of issues which have really affected their distribution. But these days, quite often a lot of the cheaper machines are not made in Japan and certainly don't offer as much as the Honda Hornet when it comes to just what's fitted to the bike and what you're getting for your money. So yeah, go check one out. It's an awesome bike. As I said, all of my comparisons is very much based around the price because I, number one, think it is an exceptional value motorcycle. I, number two, think it's probably hitting well past kind of its price, realistically speaking, and I also think you're going to have a heap of fun if you buy one of these and you're the right kind of person to buy it. Obviously, if you're looking at someone at buying an 890R or a Street Triple RS, you might find this a little bit on the simple side. However, I think it's, as I said, it's going to kick the butt of most of the 650 class bikes, the full power ones, and It's close enough to those much more expensive bikes to me that I wouldn't blink at buying one of these instead and putting all of that extra money in my pocket into a couple of little improvements and seeing how I go from there. Because yeah, it's an exceptional machine. Anyway, if you've got any questions, let me know down below in the comments. As always, stay safe out there. Thanks for watching and have a safe one.